Grays Harbor County, Washington, November 1922, 20 minutes to 7 in the evening. A bucker, 27 years old, 4 seasons in the woods. The man whose job is to saw felled trunks into mill lengths after the fallers have put them on the ground, is standing in front of a barrel stove in a bunkhouse he shares with 52 other men. He is doing the single most consequential thing he will do that night. He is deciding where on the wire to hang his socks. The wire runs the length of the room, strung above the stovepipe. It is already loaded. Shirts, trousers, underwear, and the heavy wool socks of 52 men who have been standing in wet salal and wet moss since first light. There is a good position on that wire and a bad one, close enough to the pipe that the wool dries through by morning, far enough that it does not scorch, and every man in the room knows exactly where the line between those two things falls. North Idaho logger Joe Halm described what that arrangement produced at daybreak. What a scramble for socks in the morning, first come, first served. This is not a colorful detail. It is the mechanism of the camp. A man who puts on wet wool at 5:30 is a man whose feet are cold by 8, whose caulked boots slip differently on a wet log, and whose attention at 10 in the morning is not entirely on the saw. The bunkhouse was not where the work stopped. It was where the next day's margin of safety was manufactured, or wasn't. In the short log country of western Montana, northern Idaho, and eastern Washington, investigators in 1909 and again in 1920 recorded cabins with almost no ventilation, crammed with men sleeping in muzzle-loader bunks lined with straw or pine boughs, drying their clothes on wires around the stovepipe in humid winter heat, with no means of washing themselves or their clothing, fighting lice and bedbugs continuously. 52 men, 1 stove, 1 wire, and a company that had built the building in a week and expected to move it in a year. So what, exactly, was a bunkhouse? And why was it built the way it was? The building that Bucker slept in was not designed to last. It was designed to move. From the early 1900s, Pacific Northwest companies built their camps at the worksite, and most of them opted to build bunkhouses on skids, massive timber runners under the floor frame, so the entire operation could be loaded onto rail cars and shipped to a new site once the crew had logged out the ground around it. That single construction decision explains almost everything a man complained about. There was no foundation because there was no permanence. There was no insulation because insulation is weight, and weight costs money to drag. The walls were single board. The roof was shakes or tar paper. In a Grays Harbor winter, the temperature inside was whatever the stove was doing at that moment. At its most primitive, a logging camp was 2 buildings, a cookhouse and a bunkhouse. And the larger railroad camps of the 1920s were simply that pattern multiplied. A row of skid buildings along a spur, 40 to 80 men in the sleeping quarters, a filing shack, a barn or an oil house, an office. In the smaller Puget Sound camps of the previous decade, the scale could be intimate. One documented Hood Canal camp had a bunkhouse of 16 bunks floating on the water, with the coal oil lamp blown out at 9 o'clock sharp. Better existed, and it is worth being precise about it. In 1908, the Whitney Camp on the Columbia River near Astoria, Oregon, had hot showers, a library, electric lights, refrigeration, a barber shop, and beds with springs and mattresses. That camp was reported because it was exceptional. The exception tells you what the rule was. Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you've been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of American logging between 1900 and 1980. What the falling crew, the steam donkey, the logging railroad, or the river drive actually required, what the men running them had to know, and what the wood they cut actually became once it reached the mill. Not folklore about giant lumberjacks, the documented technical reality of a dangerous trade practiced by skilled men under real physical risk. What a dry pair of socks and a clean mattress actually gave a logging crew was not comfort. It was the physical capacity to make correct decisions around falling timber 6 days in a row. And if someone in your family worked in the woods in this era, put it in the comments. Do you know which camp your relative bunked in, and did the family ever mention the food? Because in this era, that one detail told you almost everything about how a company treated the men it sent into the timber. Next, the donkey engineer, and what a running cable told him a half-second before the whistle punk knew anything at all. Back to the woods. A skid-built bunkhouse could house 80 men and cost the company almost nothing to abandon. But something in that camp could not be improvised, could not be cheap, and could not fail. And every operator in the Northwest knew exactly what it was. The thing that could not be cheap was the food. The camp cook was up at 3:30 or 4 in the morning with breakfast ready before 6, and the call to eat was a blast on a cow's horn, an iron triangle beaten with a bar, or a gong cut from a worn-out circular saw blade. By the time 50 or 80 men came down the plank walk in the dark, there were platters already on the tables. The quantities are the part that sounds like exaggeration and is not. Loggers averaged around 8,000 calories a day to hold up under a 10-hour shift. Rigging men, fallers, and buckers burned somewhere between 8 and 12 calories every minute they worked, with heavy gear and foul weather adding to the total. One estimate puts the average logger's daily intake at 5 pounds of food, and in peak season a camp might serve as many as 5 meals a day. This was not appetite, it was fuel accounting. A man who underate on Monday was a slower man on Tuesday, and a liability on Wednesday, and every camp foreman in the Northwest understood that arithmetic. Which is why the cook's position in the camp hierarchy was not what a modern viewer would expect. Feeding the men well mattered so much that the cook was often the highest paid employee in the camp, paid more in many operations than the fallers taking the physical risk. In the earlier camps, the good cook was described as the oracle of the place, appealed to by the men to settle disputes over law, love, or labor, and the men held the power to enforce it. Loggers ate enormously, and if the food was not to their liking, they simply left and hired on with another company. One documented custom for putting an unsatisfactory cook on notice was nailing his hotcakes to his door. But go into that cookhouse at 6 in the morning, and the first thing you notice is not the food, it is that nobody is speaking, and there is a reason. No talking was allowed at meals other than to ask for food to be passed, and most meals were finished inside 12 minutes. Other accounts put it at 8 minutes, with speed helped along by the no-talking rule, and by every man's need to take on board everything he could, because a slow eater would be hungry later, in the woods, where there was nothing. It is easy to read that rule as cruelty or as some austere frontier code. It was neither. It was a throughput calculation. A cookhouse that seats 40 and feeds 80 runs 2 sittings. The discipline was necessary in order to feed the number of men involved and to leave time for the cookies, the assistants learning the trade, to wash the dishes between sittings. Every minute of conversation at the first table was a minute the second crew stood outside in the rain, and a minute stripped off the front of the working day. The silence was the schedule. Around that silence a whole support staff moved. Waiters and waitresses, flunkies, often women, fired the wood stoves, did the cook's prep, waited the tables and handled the cleanup, and there were women cooks in some camps as well. Cookies also built fires and carried meals out to the crews when they were working too far from camp to come in at noon. In the Great Lakes camps, the boy at the sink was called the pearl diver, for the obvious reason. Here is the insider observation. Nobody in that room was being asked to eat quickly, because eating quickly built character. They were being asked to eat quickly because the camp was a machine with 1 boiler, 1 kitchen, and a fixed number of daylight hours, and the whole thing had been tuned to move a crew from a bunk to a stump and back with the least possible slack. The men accepted the tuning. What they would not accept, indefinitely, was where the slack had been taken out of their own bodies instead. So what happened when the men decided the arrangement had gone too far? To understand why men would tolerate that arrangement, you have to understand that most of them had not planned to stay. American logging companies through the 19th and early 20th centuries habitually operated on a cut-out and get-out policy that required a constant supply of fresh timber, and the industry therefore depended on a large mobile labor pool. Men who followed the work west as the industry moved west between the 1890s and the 1910s, some logging only, others stitching together a year out of logging, mining, and the harvest. Many carried everything they owned in a bundle on their back, and the word for them was bindle stiffs, an unwanted but necessary commodity in the timber regions of the West. The pool was made up heavily of recent immigrants and second-generation Americans. The turnover this produced was so extreme that the industry had a saying for it, recorded again and again in the period sources: 3 crews, 1 coming, 1 going, and 1 working. That figure of speech is the entire labor economics of the camp in 8 words. A company that assumed a man would be gone inside a month had no commercial reason to buy him a mattress. And the reasoning ran in a circle. because the same companies pointed at the results. Employers blamed the loggers themselves for the bed bugs and lice, on the grounds that the men brought the pests in with their own filthy bindles and bedrolls. There was a way out of that circle, and it was not going to come from the operators. Loggers were working an average 10-hour day and coming back at night in wet, muddy clothes to a camp with no place to wash and no place to dry, greasy and poor food, and a bunkhouse so small and so unventilated that one investigator recorded the steam and sweat of it as enough to overwhelm anyone not used to it. In the summer of 1917, in the middle of a war, the men in those bunkhouses found the leverage they had never had before. Where did it come from? Before you can understand why furnished bedding turned up on a list of strike demands alongside wages, you need to understand what the American entry into the First World War did to the price of a logger's labor. For roughly 3 years before 1917, a surplus of men in the region had given the operators the advantage in every negotiation. Then the war arrived, and with it an urgent military demand for Northwest spruce, the light, strong wood the Army needed for aircraft, and for framing lumber for barracks and ships. The surplus became a shortage almost overnight, and the men in the bunkhouses were the ones holding it. The Spokane-based Lumber Workers Industrial Union of the IWW set a strike date, then moved it forward to the 20th of June 1917, as men began walking off ahead of schedule. By the end of that month, logging in eastern Washington had stopped, pickets were patrolling the camps, and employers were closing the more remote operations for lack of anyone to work them. Read the demands, because the demands are the argument of this entire video. An 8-hour day, regular paydays, furnished bedding, access to showers, hiring through a union hall. Wages were on the list, so was a mattress. Northern Minnesota had already run the same experiment. In the 1916-1917 White Pine strike there, the union claimed a partial victory when conditions improved. The men got clean bedding, better food, and a wage rise larger than the one they had asked for, $45 a month against the $40 they demanded. The federal response in the Northwest was not simple. Colonel Bryce Disk was sent out in October 1917 and created both the Army's Spruce Production Division and a civilian body, the Loyal Legion of Loggers and Lumbermen, the 4L. And any employer who wanted that labor was compelled by Disk and the War Department to accept the 8-hour day and healthier living and working conditions. Men who would not sign the 4L pledge found work in the industry very hard to get, and non-members were treated as suspected radicals under a de facto blacklist. So who actually won? And what physically changed inside the bunkhouse? The strike itself ended without a clean victory. By September 1917, the walkout had collapsed under Justice Department pressure on the IWW leadership and a simple lack of funds to sustain it, and the men went back. But under the union's direction, a significant number kept the fight going inside the workplace, through what was called a conscious withdrawal of efficiency, the job strike. On the 1st of March 1918, after an announcement by Colonel Disk on behalf of the operators, the 8-hour day was recognized across the Northwest lumber industry. Union accounts from the period record what changed in the camps themselves. Instead of bunks filled with dirty hay, the men were furnished beds, clean mattresses, blankets, sheets, and pillows, changed weekly. The operators said they had granted all of it voluntarily, for patriotic reasons. 2 hours came off the working day, and the drying wire that opened this video became, in the better camps, a heated building of its own. That is the material answer to the question this whole subject poses. The bunkhouse had never been a welfare question. It was a production input. A man sleeping on clean bedding was a man not scratching all night. A man with 2 hours back was a man with a margin, and a man who could put on dry wool at 5:30 was measurably better at judging where 80 tons of Douglas fir was going to land. By the 1930s, a survey of Northwest camps recorded routine mealtimes running to corned beef, ham, bacon, roast beef, chops, steaks, chicken, oysters, potatoes, sauerkraut, fresh and canned fruit, pies, cakes, donuts, puddings, and custards. Food a good camp cook could set beside a decent hotel's. But food and bedding are the physical half. 40 to 80 men were still living in one room, for a season, a long way from anywhere. What did that actually do to them? A logging camp was a society, and the thing that defined it was that almost nobody in it had chosen to live with almost anybody else in it. 50 men in one room, 6 days a week, for a season, on a mountainside reachable only by a company train. No town, no family for most. No privacy of any kind. Not for washing, not for sleeping, not for grief. The single-window bunkhouse, the coal oil lamp out at 9, and after that 50 men breathing. What held it together was custom, an order of use for the stove, a right to a bunk, an understanding of what could and could not be said, all of it unwritten, and all of it enforced by the men themselves, because there was nobody else to enforce it. It was not a society of equals. Camps were sorted by job, and frequently by origin. Oral histories from Northwest camps record railroad section crews of Chinese workers who had their own separate cookhouse and bunkhouse within the same camp, spoken of with respect in the same breath as the segregation is described, which is exactly how such arrangements were normalized at the time. Women were present in the camps as flunkies and, in some operations, as cooks, a small population inside an overwhelmingly male world. Here is the insider observation. That isolation is usually presented as the sad part of the story. It was also the mechanism. Put 50 men who own nothing but a bindle in one room with a common grievance and no distractions, and you have not built a dormitory. You have built the most efficient organizing unit in American industry. The bunkhouse was where the 8-hour day was argued into existence, night after night, by men who had nowhere else to be, which is why what happened next did more to end camp culture than any strike ever did. What ended the bunkhouse was not a strike, a company, or a law. It was a road. Through the 1920s and accelerating after the Second World War, log trucks replaced fixed rail lines, and the truck roads went in behind them. A rail spur had to be surveyed, graded, laid, and eventually pulled up. It dictated where the camp sat, because the camp had to sit on the line. A truck road did not. And once a road existed that a vehicle could run in the dark, in the rain, in both directions, the entire economic case for housing 80 men on a mountainside evaporated. The camps did not close all at once. They thinned. A company that had run 5 camps ran 3, then 1, then a yard at the end of the county road where crews assembled at 5:30 in the morning. The word the men used for the vehicle that carried them out to the setting was a crummy, a term that had begun life meaning the canvas sack a logger kept his belongings in, and ended up meaning the truck he rode to work. By the 1950s, the classic camp was effectively gone. The men who had once lived where they worked now drove in and drove home, and slept in a house with a door that shut. If this channel is going to keep documenting what it actually took to log an American forest by hand and by steam, subscribe. There are more falling crews, more steam donkeys, more logging railroads, and more river drives that quietly built the houses, the towns, and the railroads of a growing country, and were never described as historically significant at the time because the men doing the work didn't have time to think of it that way. What a dry pair of socks and a clean mattress bought a logging crew was not comfort. It was 6 consecutive days of sound judgment around falling timber, and the men had to strike to get it. And if you have a connection, a relative who worked as a faller, a donkey engineer, a riverman, a log truck driver, put it in the comments. Do you know which camp they bunked in, and did the family ever say a word about the food? Because in this era, that was the one detail that told you everything about the company. Next, the donkey engineer, and what a running cable told him a half second before anyone else knew anything at all. The bucker's life in a Grays Harbor bunkhouse ended, in its original form, in the years after 1945. By the mid-1950s, log trucks and county roads had changed where a logging crew slept. What the road gave the trade, a man could go home at night, eat at his own table, sleep beside his family, and stop paying for his bed with a season of his life. What it did not give anyone, 50 men in one room with one stove, one wire, and one grievance, arguing the 8-hour day into existence, because there was nowhere else on earth for them to be. The bucker did not know this was what the seasons in the bunkhouse had built. He knew it the morning the crummy dropped him at the landing with dry socks he had put on in his own kitchen, and there was no one left in camp to argue with, because there was no camp. The bunkhouse had known what to ask of them. No one had thought to tell the road to ask.